All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the O'Brien Institute Friday seminar series. I would like to start by taking this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I will be the moderator of today's seminar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Tiffany Bolton, an instructor in the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program in the Community Health Sciences Department. Today's presenter is Dr. Alan Martino. Dr. Alan Martino is also an instructor in the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies program in Community Health Sciences. A little bit about Alan. His main research interests are in critical disability studies, gender and sexualities, as well as feminist and critical disability studies and theories. He's a qualitative and community-based researcher, particularly using participatory and inclusive research methodologies. His work has been published in multiple journals, including Disability Studies Quarterly, the Canadian Disability Studies Journal, and Culture, Health, and Sexuality, as well as many edited volumes focused on disability and/or sexuality studies. The title of Dr. Martino's presentation today is Being Kept Out of Sexual Fields, the Intimate Lives of Adults Labeled / with Intellectual Disabilities. I will now turn it over to you, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming today. I know it's towards the end of the term where everyone is feeling exhausted. So I really appreciate everyone here taking the time to be here. Thanks also to my colleague, Dr. Bolton, for introducing me and facilitating this discussion today. I really appreciate it. Just a quick word on accessibility. I really invite you to use the space wherever you are located right now in the most comfortable way for your body and your mind. So feel free to lie down, stand up, get up, jump up and down, knit, do whatever it takes for you to have a comfortable experience in the space you're in. Okay, I'm going to share my screen right now. Fantastic. Okay, so here's the plan for today. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the audience to two key concepts, eugenics and intimate citizenship. Then I will share some of the interview data that comes from my qualitative projects focused on the intimate lives of adults labeled with intellectual disabilities. And finally, I'd like to provide some tips on how we can best support disabled people when it comes to sexuality. My interest in this field of disability and sexuality emerged from multiple places in my own lived experiences and those around me. First of all, growing up with an older sibling with a developmental disability allowed me to see some of the challenges that he has faced when it came to having an intimate life that he desires. Family members like my own often feel very uncomfortable talking about sexuality and supporting our loved ones. Secondly, I've always been a volunteer in different service organizations in the communities and working with people with intellectual disabilities. One particular day was really key to my work as a researcher. I was in this exercise, this arts-based exercise, and one young man with Down syndrome was on stage, and that's when he said, as part of his scene, "Love is natural, we all love." The room was totally fine with that particular statement. Indeed, I heard even from the audience things like, "Oh, that's so cute." But then 2 minutes later, the same young man says, "SEX, that's what I want." Now, that statement completely changed the vibe in the room, right? The room was made of other folks with intellectual disabilities and support workers. People looked at each other uncomfortable. I heard nervous laughter. And then the person leading the session, a support worker, immediately decided to change the topic of the conversation by saying, "Isn't the weather beautiful today?" And right after that, the scene just ended and we moved on to another one. To me, that really highlighted how uncomfortable people are with this topic, but how conversations around sexuality should not be completely shut down and treated like an elephant in the room that we all kind of choose to ignore and move on. When we think about the sexualities of people labeled with intellectual disabilities, we recognize that this remains a taboo topic. In our social world, there are still two dominant controlling images, and I'm borrowing from the language of Patricia Collins here, images that define the sexualities of people with disabilities. On one hand, they're desexualized, seen as childlike, innocent. Sometimes I hear from people in the community that, people with intellectual disabilities have no desire for intimate relationships. How come? On the other hand, I also see very often the notion that people with intellectual disabilities have dangerous sexualities, that they might be hyperactive and might pose a risk to other members in the community. The problem is that no matter where people fall into this scale of images, what we see very often is that opportunities for sexual expression are often denied, curtailed, and people experience significant levels of surveillance in their everyday lives. Of course, vulnerability is an extremely important thing for us to consider. When we look at the statistics, we see that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to experience forms of abuse in comparison with non-disabled people. At the same time, what critical disability studies scholars highlight over and over again is that, more importantly, instead of focusing on individuals and their supposedly lack of ability to make choices, we should look at the structural ways in which we make people with disabilities more vulnerable. For example, when we remove decision-making power from people's everyday lives, where they cannot even choose what to wear, where they want to go, when they would like to go, how do we expect anyone to make, in quotes, good decisions about their intimate lives? Also, by not giving sex education to people with intellectual disabilities, we are removing people's abilities to have the vocabulary to even articulate experiences that might be abusive. So I kindly invite everyone here in the audience to think about how society and we as a community make people more vulnerable, rather than focusing on vulnerability simply as an individual social phenomenon. This intersection of disability and sexuality continues to be still under-researched and under-theorized. And that's where I'm trying to make a contribution here. I make this contribution by drawing on what is called the sexual fields theoretical framework. This builds on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, a sociologist. Sexual fields are in essence spaces that bring together people who are in the search for intimacy, love, and pleasure. Think about dating apps, clubs, coffee shops, and other spaces that we can easily think of. The sexual fields framework is made of three particular key concepts. Sexual fields, as I said, these are spaces that have hierarchies of desirability. In particular sexual fields, there are particular bodies, particular attributes that people bring to the table that are more or less valued. For example, if you go to queer spaces that value a particular subculture, someone who follows that subculture will have more potential of landing the partner that they want. The second concept that I think is very important is the notion of sexual capital. Every time we enter a sexual field, we bring with us certain attributes, physical, mental, psychological, personality-wise, some that have more value than others. So when I go to a dating app, right, being a person of color can be both an attribute that helps me get the partner I want, or might be a barrier, depending on the sexual capital that is valued in each sexual field. Finally, this notion of erotic habitus really talks about how, as we grow up, we become to desire certain social actors in our society. We create preferences that are not just inherent or innate in us, but that we learned to appreciate, right? For example, there's a lot of scholarship about queer spaces and how queer white bodies tend to be more privileged in these spaces. So this sexual fields framework provides some really interesting vocabulary to think about the intimate lives of people with intellectual disabilities. Yet, before my work, this framework was never used to talk about people with disabilities and their experiences. One of the assumptions that we currently see in the sexual fields literature is that we assume that sexual actors know where they should go to find partners, and that they're able to enter and participate in sexual fields. Yet, what I found in my research is that people with intellectual disabilities sometimes don't know the sexual fields that are available to them, or are not allowed to enter the sexual fields that are available to them for many reasons. And I'll give you some examples of those barriers that keep people out of sexual fields. So in a way, my research highlights that even before we talk about and examine the experience of people who are in sexual fields, we need to look at those outside of sexual fields, those that for some reason are not able to participate in the spaces that can lead to experience of intimacy, pleasure, and partnership. So for my project, I have 3 research questions. For this presentation today, I'm going to focus on the first one. What are some of the systematic barriers that prevent adults with intellectual disabilities from participating in sexual fields? Before we talk about the current experiences of people with disabilities in our communities, it's very important that we just quickly acknowledge the history that we have here in Canada and around the globe. Here, I'm talking about the concept of eugenics, a term coined in 1883 that supposedly means well-born. The notion of the eugenicist claim was that social problems and forms of inequality were genetically inherited. They advocated for the marriage regulation and what they called selective breeding. The idea was that we needed to encourage some sections of our populations to reproduce and have more children. Here, meaning white, middle-class, non-disabled, heterosexual families. At the same time that we wanted to find ways to discourage some other sectors of our communities from reproducing. We're talking about Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, certain immigrant groups. In the United States, for example, we had what was called the fittest families competitions. Here on this photo, we see the winners of the median family class or of a fitter families contest as they posed for the 1927 Kansas Free Fair. The American Eugenics Society was founded as the direct result of a general international conference on eugenics. They went around the country selling this idea that there are better ways of creating better humans. Here's a poster from the American Eugenics Society that promoted these ideas of what they called racial betterment. One of the sides here of the poster says unfit human traits like feeble-mindedness, epilepsy, criminality, insanity, alcoholism, pauperism, many others running families, and are inherited in exactly the same way as color in guinea pigs. If all marriages were eugenic, we could breed out most of the unfitness in 3 generations. Again, this notion that we can kind of trace deviance, right, through people's family trees, and that we could breed out certain populations in our society that were not deemed fit to be a part of our social world. Alberta was a particular a province that had a high number of eugenic policies and practices. Indeed, Alberta was responsible for 90% of more than 2,800 cases of involuntary sterilization of marginalized peoples in Canada between 1928 and 1972 under the Sterilization Act. This wasn't a hidden practice. We indeed have files, and we have even field notes from the meetings where people were deciding whether or not someone should be sterilized against their consent. The act allowed for the sterilization without consent for people whose IQs registered below 70 or who were deemed to be in a psychotic state. What is really shocking, and I have a colleague, Jana Greco in University of Alberta, who had a chance to look at the historical files here in our province, and she found that some of the decisions around whether or not someone should be sterilized was done under 10 minutes. So that seems to suggest that even before someone stepped into those rooms to even make a case, a decision was already made in a lot of these cases. Now, we may say that these policies ended in the 1970s and that we have learned from the past. Yet, one of the most heartbreaking parts of being a sociologist and doing this kind of work is that we still see evidence of a lot of eugenic practices happening in our social world today. And here, the concept of eugenics is a particular relevant one. Eugenics, as the website Eugenics and Eugenics defines, means going beyond biological and medical interventions to encompass systematic barriers to education, services, policies, and supports for disabled people in terms of sexuality and reproduction. One of the tricky things about eugenic practices is that sometimes they work in more covert ways in comparison with past eugenic practices and policies. The other scary thing that I see very often is that sometimes eugenic practices happen through the lens of a benevolent action. I've seen, for example, people saying, let's just put Mary on birth control. It's just good for her, without even giving Mary any decision-making power in this, decision of whether or not to be on birth control, or providing evidence, good information to Mary to make the decision. So these practices still take place in our social world. So before I give you some examples, I really hope that you can also think about the concept of intimate citizenship. This is a term coined by Ken Plummer, a sociologist of sexualities, and this term refers to our rights to choose what we do with our bodies, our feelings, our identities, our relationships, our genders, our eroticisms, and our representations. Even though the sexual rights of people with disabilities are assured by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and the World Health Organization, what we see on the ground is that the intimate citizenship of the people with disabilities are still denied and absent. So let me give you some examples of what eugenic practices can look like. One of the most common practices that I've seen is the infantilization of people labeled with intellectual disabilities. One example I can give you is Matthew, 39 years old man who is his own guardian, who told me multiple times during his interview that he was not ready for intimate relationships. When I asked him about what made him feel that way, that's when he says, "My mother told I'm not ready." What is interesting to me in some of these interviews is that it wasn't a decision assessment that people made of themselves, but it was often a decision of readiness that was made by other people in their lives. When I asked him to elaborate a little bit more on this, that's when he said that his mom had told him, "I have too much homework, too much." The notion of having too much homework and prioritizing that instead of intimate relationships, it's usually something we tell children or teenagers, but not something we would tell a 39-year-old man. When I asked him about when he might be ready for intimate relationships, that's when he said, "When I get a bit older, like 50. Indeed, he wasn't the only one who had heard from people in their lives, including family members and support workers, that he should wait until his 50s, sometimes even his 60s or their 60s, to have a first intimate relationship in their lives. Even watching pornography, something that he could do on his own to experience pleasure, was off the plate. As he says, "Mom told me I need to be older to watch that." I've also witnessed cases of participants who had received misinformation about their sexual rights. It's hard to know if this misinformation was done purposely or not. In the literature, we certainly have evidence that sometimes people do get information purposely, misinformation purposely, to make sure that people are not being intimate with others. Thomas was a great example of this when in his interview, he actually turned the table and he asked me a question. He says, "So you have to be 36 to get married?" When I told him that actually in the province of Ontario, you can get married at an earlier age, that's when he responds to me with a shocked look on his face. "Okay, so if you're 18, you can get married." "Okay, because no one ever told me about that." I certainly have other examples from my fieldwork and colleagues of people who have received wrong information about sexuality and sexual rights and even how bodies operate. The other thing that it was very common in my interview was the fact that a lot of people are receiving information about sexuality that solely focus on negative aspects of sexuality. David is an example of this. He says, well, we talked about the parts, the different parts of the male and the female, about STIs, STDs, what transmitted diseases is. I think we talked about everything, about what sexuality is all about. What stood out to me here in this piece of conversation was that he talks about STIs, right, and body parts as what sexuality is all about. It's unfortunate that I cannot see your faces today, but I think most of us would agree here in this room that sexuality is not just about STIs. It's about love, it's about intimacy, it's about hookups on a Friday night, it's about holding hands, it's about getting to know one's own body and having a vocabulary to articulate what one wants. Yet, folks are getting so much negative information about sexuality with little, if none, if any, conversations around pleasure and positive aspects of sexuality that it becomes something so scary. It discourages some participants even from wanting to pursue sexuality and intimacy. Randy, for example, says, sometimes they make it scary. This is inappropriate, or this is wrong, or this is illegal, or this is dangerous. This isn't fun anymore. I don't want to do it, have sex. It's not going to be any good. Putting into the context that sex education and sex information for people with disabilities often focus solely on negative aspects of sexuality, it shouldn't be surprising that Randy feels very hesitant to even want to explore this part of his life. Information can also be delivered in infantilizing and problematic ways. Let me give you an example from James. James talks about his sex education. He's a 34 years old man. He says, I did the course in my school. I know the birds and the bees, how to make the babies, stuff like that. Again, this notion of the birds and the bees is not information that we would, expect adults to be holding on to, right? This is something that we usually tell children just to avoid having the sex talk until we can wait until a later time in their lives. But most shockingly, in his interview, he told me about his relationship with a young woman with an intellectual disability and what he had learned from support workers and his agency. He said that being a good man meant no touch. I never touch her. My girl would never chew. I ask her to stop. I put my hand up like this. I say, excuse me. I says, stop right there. This is a couple that has been together for over 5 years now. And yet, the ways that they're learning about sexuality is that it's just inappropriate to touch your partner in any sexual or intimate way. Again, when we think about most non-disabled relationships, this is not something that we expect to see. Allison echoed the same message that she got from people in her life when she talks about her relationship with her partner. She says, always distance from each other. I'm okay if he's beside me, but not that close. So what is interesting here is that even when people with intellectual disabilities are able to form intimate relationships, those relationships do not look like normative kinds of relationships. For example, not being able to see each other every day, having phone calls surveilled by family members and support workers. I spoke with couples who have been together for 10 years, who are still not able to live together, who can only see each other sometimes twice a week, and they see each other in spaces like group homes or date programs. And one of the rules in these programs is that people are not allowed to touch each other. So that leaves very little space for people to talk to each other, have intimate moments, having alone time, despite being couples for almost 10 years. Not surprising, because of the lack of opportunities to explore their sexualities and to have access to good information, a lot of participants told me about this lack of a game or lack of a feel for the game. Some participants, for example, Yago and Andrew, told me, where do I start? I don't even know how to start looking. Andrew specifically even says, I've looked for a girlfriend almost all over. Nobody. People don't help me. I would have loved if someone could help me find a girlfriend. Andrew was someone who was even proactive, and he asked one of his support workers for support in this part of his life. But the only advice he got was just go out more. If you grow up being told that it's not okay to be intimate with someone, that you don't even have a language to articulate, intimate relationships, the advice just go out more is meaningless. It's not helpful to people. For some participants, the only way to have relationships outside of this huge level of control and surveillance they experience in their lives is by keeping relationships a secret. A great example of this is Chelsea. She's someone who has so much surveillance, who lives in a group home where she cannot bring any men to her room. She even has a roommate. That makes it very difficult to bring someone. And she has a very interesting moment in her interview. At first, her support worker was sitting with us for her comfort. And then the phone rings, the support worker has to leave for a few seconds. And that's when Chelsea whispers very quickly to me, "We're not having sex, but just because we're in love, but don't tell Linda, the support worker, that. Nobody knows about me and him. It's a secret. Don't tell Linda. Promise me you won't tell Linda. He's my boyfriend and I don't want anyone to know. You won't tell nobody?" That's when the support worker comes back to the room and we pretend that this never happened. Chelsea was not the only person that had to keep a relationship a secret. The most troubling aspect of it, though, is that sometimes the only way of keeping relationships was having secrets, and that placed people in risky situations. For example, I spoke with two young men whose only private space to have kind of as intimate moments was public parks. Any other place in their lives, they had so much surveillance. Their living homes, their living arrangements, their work arrangements, everywhere else, they had so much surveillance and control that only public parks became private spaces for them. Isn't it shocking? So living arrangements is a very significant barrier that keeps people from being able to access sexual fields. For example, I remember talking to one young man who told me that he had a curfew. He had to be back at the home by 9 p.m. every day. Now, I wish again I could see your faces, but I think most of us would agree that the fun usually starts after 9 p.m. Most young people, for example, this young man who was 25 at the time of the interview, he told me like he wasn't able to go to clubs with his friends. So that limits a lot of opportunities for people. I've also spoken with a lot of people who live in housing arrangements where they have little privacy. They live in small rooms with single beds, no door locks. People were not even allowed to have pornography in their own private spaces. As I mentioned, one of the aspects of eugenics is this notion that some parts of our social society or some social groups should not reproduce, right? Those are undesirable. And this is evident even in some of the interviews that I've done. William, 32 years old, for example, is someone who managed to get married to a young woman with intellectual disabilities, and he shares that with a support worker. That's when he says, "When I got married, the support worker said, so we need to get you to the health unit and all that because, oh, you can have children. You don't know how to take, you're not capable of that." I mean, in our social world, usually when someone says to us that they just got married, the first response we have is, "Congratulations, that's fantastic news." But it's interesting how here the first response from a support worker is that we need to make sure that this couple is on birth control. The notion that we need to avoid having potential children that will be or might be supposedly a burden to society. Okay. Another example I'd like to share is from two support workers who I have interviewed and who also spoke about the reproductive rights of people with intellectual disabilities. Alice, a support worker who has been in the field for over 10 years, told me about depot shot is so common. Every girl who could potentially be sexually active, whether or not she is on depot shot. Like every single woman of childbearing years who I worked with who had the potential to have sex was on birth control. So what is also interesting that I've seen repeatedly in other interviews is that women with intellectual disabilities are very likely to be put on birth control, sometimes at a very early age, even at age 14. But the most troubling aspect of it is cases that I've seen of women with intellectual disabilities being put on birth control without their knowledge, nobody telling them that this is birth control, or explaining potential side effects, or allowing them to be a part of the decision-making process of what they want for their reproduction, right? And their reproductive rights. That to me is the most troubling aspect. And what Alice suggests here is that this is not always a matter of choice for people with intellectual disabilities. As she says, it will be really passively aggressively put across and manipulated into thinking that you made that decision to go on depot, but really it wasn't. It wasn't your decision. She tells me about the case of a young woman who was simply told, you know that time of the month where things get dirty? That I can make that go away. Don't you want that? Again, without informing women with intellectual disabilities what that actually means and what their rights are. One final example I'll give you here, which is extremely scary, is Rose, another support worker. She shares a story of a couple with intellectual disabilities who got caught having sex with each other in a group home. That's when she says, her family was so angry and they moved her out of the community, and she also had a surgery. Whatever they did to us, what's the proper term when you remove someone's sexuality, like their reproductive parts? Then I ask, like sterilization? Yes, that's it, she says. Yeah, I remember this young lady told me about this. When she explained to me, she seemed quite okay with it. Of course she would be. The way, I don't think she understood what that meant. Takes a deep breath. So even what I hope that the quotes I'm sharing here illustrates is that these are all examples of eugenic practices, but it shows the extent that these eugenic practices can happen, from very subtle, right, infantilization, misinformation, to something as extreme as sterilization. So as we can see, it's very hard for a lot of people with intellectual disabilities to even know how to participate in sexual fields, where they should go, or even be allowed to go. Instead of focusing on individuals, we need to look at the structural forces that shape, the barriers for people with disabilities to have those opportunities just like anyone else. What is very clear to me is that people with disabilities rarely have an opportunity to talk about pleasure, love, intimacy, anything that makes this sexuality seen as a positive aspect of life. Of course, there is hope, right? So, for example, critical disability studies are talking about the need to create a new sexual culture, or what is called cripping sexualities. Cripping meaning transforming or transformation. As Robert McClure and Anna Malo talks about, they say, disability can transform sex, creating confusions about what and who is sexy, what counts as sex. For me, disability can challenge a lot of the ways in which we believe the scripts of sex and sexuality should always take place. From an early age, we kind of learn how sexuality or sex should unfold. You meet someone, you dance with them, you take them home, a hookup session happens, you say goodbye. But what my participants seem to illustrate is that we can expand the ways we think about sex and sexuality. One participant, for example, asked me, I don't understand why I cannot tell jokes during sex. It's interesting, but in our social scripts of sex, we believe that sex needs to be a serious social act almost. As another example, I had a support worker who told me about this young man who really wanted to take what is called a dick pic. Even if you want it or not, they come your way. So dick pics are part of our social life in sexual fields now. Unfortunately, due to physical impairment, this young man wasn't able to do it himself. So the support workers in the room were able to create this whole concoction to help him have the phone located in a particular space, in a particular angle, and that he would be able to do it himself. They helped him undress, they left the room, let him do whatever he wanted to do on his own, and then came back and undid the whole concoction. To me, that gives me an example of how we can think a lot more creatively of how these practices can be done. In this book, Tobin Sievers talks about another example, a young person who could not feel anything below the waist, but who could feel a lot of pleasure simply by having their earlobes touched. We have amazing examples of people with lived experiences who are showing us how disability and sexuality should not be a taboo topic. One great example is the work of Andrew Gerza. Andrew Gerza used to have a podcast called Deliciously Disabled. Here are two words that we rarely hear on the same sentence. Now he has another podcast called Disability After Dark that is exclusively trying to shine light on this intersection of disability, sexuality, and queerness. Another great example is this group called Drag Syndrome from the UK. It's a group of folks with Down syndrome who perform as in drag. What is interesting is that some of the critiques that the group has received is that they're being exploited by the director of this group, who is a non-disabled person. Again, the notion that people with intellectual disabilities are childlike and innocent and vulnerable, that they're unable to understand their own practices or make decisions of their own. But what this group illustrates over and over again is that this is something that they desire to do and that it's important in their own lives. Now, one of the questions that people ask me, especially healthcare professionals, is what can we do? How do we engage in conversations with people? So some of the things that I would like to encourage people to consider is, first of all, people with disabilities, just like anyone else, has different levels of comfort and different desires for their lives. Some people might not feel comfortable talking to a healthcare professional about their sexual lives, and some might. We need to also be able to engage with other social actors as allies. We're talking about parents, siblings, direct care workers, people who actually may interact a lot more with people with lived experiences and who can help us facilitate more opportunities for people in the community. We also need to be prepared to have conversations around sexual cultures and desires that we may not be familiar with, but that we might still need to support people in getting connected with. I remember, for example, one young man who told me throughout his interview about his foot fetish. And indeed, he looked at my feet a few times as well, but that's okay. I'll leave that aside. But one of the things that he told me about is his desire to connect with this community that share the same desire. I think our responsibility as healthcare providers and support workers and people who deliver care is, even if I don't have the answer for this question, is that I'm going to make an effort to find someone who does have the information or someone who can support. And there are resources in our communities. We need to go beyond heteronormative cisgender understandings of disabled people. We often deny queerness as a possibility for people with intellectual disabilities. I've seen firsthand examples like, oh, Mike and Joni are holding hands, but they're just good friends. Even though some of us know that no, they actually have desire towards one another. They love each other. Also, we need to be comfortable talking beyond just body parts, chemistry, and STIs. We need to be able to talk about pleasure. How can we support people who are in rehabilitation and who come to us asking about how to have pleasurable relationships? How can we give them the vocabulary and the creativity and support their creativity and be able to have their sexual life they want to? Finally, it's essential that we collaborate with people with lived experiences. They bring extreme knowledge. They know what the priorities are. They know what the resources should be or are available in the community. Engage with self-advocates, engage with people with lived experiences. Of course, when we engage with multiple social actors like this, it's important to acknowledge different social groups will have different values, expectations, and desires. I've certainly encountered family members who are extremely supportive of the sexual rights and experience of their loved ones, but I also faced family members who completely want to ignore their part of their lives, or who simply refuse to even mention the word sexuality. What I encourage people here to do is to take the time to understand where people come from. First of all, as a parent, for example, I can imagine the fear that it would be to have a loved one with a disability, knowing the statistics of sexual abuse among this population. So we need to be able to understand what are the concerns that parents have, the siblings have, the direct care workers have. But most importantly, we need to reframe the ways in which people think about sexuality. The biggest one is vulnerability, right? One of the things that sometimes I encounter is people who genuinely believe that not giving information to people with disabilities about sexuality will prevent people from being sexual and getting into trouble and being in danger. But it's actually the opposite. When we look at the literature, we find evidence that if we don't provide sex education, we make people more vulnerable to abuse. So that's how I try to reframe the conversation about the rights of people with disabilities. Again, we're not alone in this. We can count on a multitude of social actors like self-advocates, supportive families, care workers, sexologists, a whole bunch of social actors who are willing to engage in these conversations. The other piece that I see very often as a challenge is that we often think about people with intellectual disabilities as not able to understand information about sexuality. Indeed, what the literature suggests is that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to be automatically removed from sex education on the assumption that they shouldn't get that information or that they wouldn't understand that information. Yet, I choose to reframe this question and move it in a direction that we need to change how we deliver information. I think it's a matter of how information can be delivered in accessible ways to people with intellectual disabilities. I remember one young man with Down syndrome who told me about the banana in a condom. He was so confused about what this banana meant. So we cannot take for granted the ways that different people process information in different ways. So the banana in the condom might not be the best way to explain protection and STIs to everyone. Some of my tips for plain language is use active voice when talking to people and writing documents. Choose simpler words. No one should say, I'm going to utilize the washroom. I simply say, I will use the washroom. Let's bring that to some of the work that we're doing with community members. Break up long sentences into paragraphs. Break up ideas when you're talking to someone. Cut unnecessary descriptive wording and be creative. There are so many ways of informing people with disabilities about their rights, their responsibilities, their ways of engaging. Let me give you one example that I've used in my own research. So instead of simply asking people for their consent, I've used plain language and image. Look at this example. You're invited to join my research project, and that is followed by the image of someone with an intellectual disability looking very inquisitive as they hold a glass, magnifying glass. Second, then I follow, if you agree, I will interview you. Right under that, there is an image of a woman and a man around the table. There is a recorder between them and someone taking notes. Finally, I will ask you about your romantic and sexual lives. Here again, we see a couple with intellectual disability holding hands, looking at each other in a loving way with red roses at the back. So what I want to push people here to do is, instead of focusing on individual and individual traits, abilities, attributes, we need to look at the ways that we can make a difference. Finally, I'd like to end with an invitation to my colleagues here. First of all, I love collaborating with people across different disciplines, but there's so much work that remains to be done. For example, we need more intersectional work in this field. We need to understand sexualities in the plural, looking at the experience, for example, of queer disabled people and their experiences in sexual fields that are focused on queer people. We need more opportunities for people with disabilities to articulate their understandings and experiences with intimacy, pleasure, and desires. We need to understand how geography plays a role in terms of accessing sexual fields and having opportunities to access sex education. We need to look at the curriculum in our provinces, including in Alberta, where I'm just starting a project where I'm looking at the policies here in our province and how they shape the opportunities of people with intellectual disabilities. Finally, we need a multi-level analytic approach. We need to look at individual experiences, but we shouldn't stay there. We need to look at a broader structural level of how policies, for example, may discourage some people from forming families. We know, for example, in some provinces in Canada, if someone with an intellectual disability gets married, they're likely to lose some of their funds and that they get from the government. The funds people receive are already very small. People with intellectual disabilities in Canada, for example, and we have statistics on this, are more likely to be living under poverty line than non-disabled people. So we need to understand how culture, policies, and practices continue to create barriers, new eugenic practices that prevent people with disabilities from having the lives that they want. All right, I'm going to stop right there so we have a lot of time for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. So yes, we're at the Q&A portion, and we will be using the question and answer Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I see that there is one, no, there's lots of questions. Okay, sorry. We'll go with the first one though, Alan. I'm curious if you find it more common for disabled people to be queer, and if yes, why this might be.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I'm actually currently doing a project that focuses on the experiences of queer people with intellectual disabilities in Alberta. We have been able to conduct around 31 interviews at this point. And indeed, we find that there are quite a few people in our communities who are at this intersection of disability and queerness. There's not a lot that we know yet about the biological or the social explanations for this, but we've been finding some really interesting themes around the fact that not a lot of queer disabled people feel comfortable participating in queer spaces because they tend to be inaccessible or not welcoming. And we also find that they're not getting information that is relevant to them. So a lot of people are not getting the vocabulary to talk about queerness until later in their lives, in their 30s and sometimes even 40s. So those are some of the interesting preliminary findings we're getting in our study.
So the next point, I think, is more of a comment talking about access to normalcy and this idea we get less dopamine from fitting in to begin with. So I don't know if you want to talk about any of those ideas anymore, or move on to the next one.
I'll just say very quickly, I think what I love the most about the work that people with lived experience are doing now through blog posts, podcasts, and TV shows is that they're even moving beyond normalcy and really questioning what does it mean to be normal and having a normal sexuality. I think that's the most interesting part of the work that I'm doing now.
All right, so next question is about barriers as a social researcher. And I know that you can talk about some of these, Alan. So some of the barriers you faced in terms of exploring, researching the intimate lives of disabled people / people with disabilities, and what you did to sort of overcome those or address those barriers.
Yeah, I would say that one of the first barriers is stereotypes that people hold of people with intellectual disabilities. Notions that, they don't have credible knowledge or important knowledge to share. So in my interactions, for example, with ethic review boards across different universities, I've gotten comments like, why don't you just talk to family members? Are they gonna give you any good data? People with intellectual disabilities. I've also been, highly encouraged to talk to other people in people with disability lives, parents, support workers, which is interesting because when you look at the literature, those are the voices that we're more likely to hear from. Support workers, social workers, everyone else except people with lived experiences themselves. So for me, it has been a process of educating ethic review boards and colleagues about different ways of understanding disability and understanding the importance of what the mantra of disability activism, nothing about us without us. It's extremely important that we include people with lived experiences in the work that we're doing. People should have the right to say yes to research. It's not only about the right to say no to research participation. And we need to value the knowledge, the experience, the insights that disabled people bring to knowledge making.
All right, thanks, Ellen. So the next question is about your thoughts on the impact of purity culture on disabled people's sexuality, given that our culture tends to infantilize everyone who is not or has not been in a straight marriage.
Yeah, really interesting. If I understand the question correctly, I mean, the level of infantilization of people with intellectual disabilities is huge. It's one of the, I think, central barriers that we encounter. Because when we treat someone as a child, first of all, we don't like to talk about sex with children. We see this as inappropriate or dangerous or not okay, right, in our social world. So that cuts already a lot of opportunities. We tend to shelter children from sex and sexuality, right? So that already curtails a lot of opportunities for people. To me, the most scary part is just this kind of prolonged adolescence, state of adolescence, or prolonged state of childhood that people are experiencing. To hear from a 39-year-old man that he should wait until his 40s and 50s, to have a relationship for the first time, it really makes me question what is happening here. Is it that we want to avoid this conversation as much as possible, so we keep postponing it? Or is it that we want to make sure that people are not having relationships, so we'll use this as a strategy for that? So lots of issues with this infantilization that is happening here.
Yeah, definitely. The quote that you put up there when he said, I've been told I need to wait till I'm 50. I think we can all, we think about our own lives, that it's quite shocking, right?
Mhm.
All right, so this is such amazing and important work. Have you worked with the REB to allow for plain language consents? Is this the main consent letter, or is this an addition to the main consent letter?
Yeah, this is great. So what I usually do is that I have multiple formats, from larger print to plain language to image and even more plain language. I'm being very lucky that I have colleagues who are experts in writing plain language. So I've had a chance to have them look over my documents every time. And what I found useful too is consulting people with lived experience. Can you please take a look at this, for me? Does it make sense? Should I change the language here? Is there any question that doesn't make sense to you? And of course, paying people for their time, right? The labor that they're doing in supporting the work we do. Thankfully, I've been very lucky to encounter REB, committees that really are open to have plain language consent forms, including UFC. I told them that it doesn't make sense to use the typical form that they use. I proposed a new one and they accepted it. So to me, that gives me a sign that people are open to trying to engage community in a different way.
All right, thank you for that. And then I'm just seeing that there's a comment that two people are using one account, so just to keep that in mind. And then the next question, and this is something that I was thinking about as well, is part of this seems to be education for support workers. I've worked at 4 organizations and none even mentioned sexuality in any training materials. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is quite common. We do have some literature even on this. What if we find is that there's a lot of mixed practices and policies across different service providers. We have service providers who are providing quite a bit of training to their support workers and having very clear policies that state the rights of people with disabilities. And we have some that when I call them, for example, to ask for their support in my projects, they hang up on me as soon as I said the word sexuality, or they said that they have nothing to share. Or I've also heard that there are more important issues to talk about, that I should focus instead on employment and education. Of course, employment and education are important issues in people's lives, sure, but I think that doesn't mean that sexuality should totally be put aside or shouldn't be considered also as a part of people's lives. So what I've seen by talking to support workers is that there's a lot of non-standard ways of engaging when something happens. So I've spoken with staff members, for example, who were told that they should just redirect. That was the term they use. If someone ever asks us a question or says something related to sexuality, you talk about the weather. Isn't the weather beautiful today? Oh, the sun, isn't it gorgeous today? Which is a completely, problematic way of not acknowledging someone's sexuality and acknowledging someone's desire. Can you imagine sharing something important to you to someone and they simply change the topic and tell you about the weather, right? So sometimes staff members are getting problematic things, information like this. And some staff members, they do want to do something, but they feel so constrained by policies and values of their organizations that they just feel powerless. I remember one person who worked for a particular religious organization where condoms were not allowed to be distributed to their folks, right? But she thought that it was extremely important that people should be protected, as they engage in sex in the community. So she would go and pay with her own money, hidden to a pharmacy, and buy condoms and distribute to people. I mean, there are examples of people who are trying to, go around these policies and trying to do better, which I think that should be the way to go.
So I'm just going to click that one was answered. Okay, so have you been able to present your research to the people that participated? And if not, I think that would be a great idea.
Absolutely. So that's always something that I do in my projects. As soon as we finally, analyze the data, have some solid findings, I like to go back to participants and share, in different formats, some of the results we find, either through like a report in plain language or through presentations out in the community. Again, as a community-based researcher, I'm very lucky to have community partners who are open, to having me come back and share results with family members, support workers, and people with lived experiences. They need to know how their stories are being used and articulated out there. Especially, we have a terrible history of engaging people with disabilities in research in ways that are not ethical, right? And I think it is important that people know how their knowledge is making a difference and having an impact.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just a comment when you were talking about the support worker and the condoms. Somebody has written disability harm reduction, just in the chat there. Okay, so are you familiar with ABS4U? So you know what the acronym there means, right, Alan? Okay. So they support people, involving people with lived experience in all aspects of research. So I don't know, have you worked with them at all?
I haven't worked with them, but I'm certainly familiar. A colleague of mine actually told me about them recently. I think, what I see as a new person here in Calgary, just moved here last year, and for me, it has been very interesting, the process of connecting with organizations and kind of starting to build those relationships. And what became clear to me very quickly, especially in my project around queerness and disability, is that organizations are not always talking to each other. So we have amazing organizations doing work around queerness and providing amazing services to queer youth, but they're not speaking to organizations in the disability sector. So for me, the most exciting part of my job is to say, hey, folks, by not talking to each other and learning from each other in our struggles here, we're not able to provide the holistic support that people actually need. So for example, in our interviews with people, in the community, they often tell us that they feel that they cannot be queer in disability-related spaces, and that in disability spaces, people are not thinking about queerness. They're not thinking about sexualities. So there's a clear disconnect between communities here that I keep pushing to, creating these opportunities for collaboration. So I actually just got a grant accepted a few weeks ago that brings together both sectors, organizations from both sectors, and we're going to work together on the research like this. So I'm excited to do that work.
It's really exciting. So I think there's just, oh no, I think we've actually managed to get all of them, Alan, just like in the right amount of time, because at least my computer's saying it's 12:59 and I was told to try to wrap up by 12:58. So thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you, Alan, for a really thought-provoking seminar presentation. I put in the chat that the webinar is recorded, but if you have any follow-up questions or anything that Alan didn't get to, please email iph@ucalgary.ca, and then Dr. Martino can answer your questions later and follow up.
Absolutely. Thanks for the
everybody.
opportunity.